Fellow Ghanaians, a very good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us here on UPfront on the JoyNews channel. My name is Winston Amwa, and Parliament is still debating the 2021 budget and economic policy of government. And the minority has been raising a few issues now. They say government should come clean when it comes to, deficit financing in the 2020 budget. They think that based on the facts in the budget, some few things are still unclear, and they would want government to do that. They've also been questioning government's decision to introduce new taxes. They say this is not the right time to introduce new taxes, bearing in mind that Ghanaians are already struggling. I am sure many of you, or some of you, would say, yes, Ghanaians are struggling, and so no need for new taxes. But one group of person, if I could put it that way, which also may be happy about this, could probably be the financial sector, or particularly the banks. They've been questioning the decision by government to impose a 5% profit before tax on them. They say they're paying taxes. So why would government want to do that? Some have raised the question, why does government want to pass on its own mistakes to the banking sector when government could have gone about the banking sector cleanup in a different way? This evening, we're privileged to be joined by the CEO of the Ghana Association of Bankers, John Ewuah. He'll be helping us to understand what the problems of the banks are when it comes to this 5% profit before tax that has been imposed on them. John Ewuah has joined us via Zoom. John, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. I believe you're doing very well.
God's grace, and thank you very much for having me.
Great. Even before we get to the specific issue of the challenges that the banking sector may have with the imposition of that new tax that's supposed to help offset the 21 billion Ghana cedis that has cost us in cleaning the financial sector, what's your general impression about the 2021 budget?
I think the finance minister before last year closed was quite emphatic when he said that we need accelerated economic recovery in the post-COVID era. And in my honest assessment, I think most of the key items in the budget are all geared towards accelerating the pace of the recovery process. So as a country, we can run away from the vagaries of the pandemic, which was first and foremost a health hazard, and with it became an economic hazard as well. So in my view, my honest assessment is that it's one that is basically planned to put the country on a footing to accelerate its pace of recovery.
Talking about putting the country on the right footing, so we've seen introduction of taxes, new taxes. We'll get to your taxes shortly, but what do you make, for instance, of the 1% increment in the national health insurance levy? There's also been a 1% increase in the VAT flat rate, and also the imposition of a 10 pesos, sanitation and pollution levy. What do you make of these?
The first and foremost, the point I will make in connection with levying of those taxes is particularly when you pick up the NHIL levy. We all know we're coming from an environment where, as a country, or even just the global economy, nobody could see COVID coming. And therefore, resources that should have gone into area A or area B, or sector A or sector B, all of a sudden had to be rechanneled. As a country, I'm sure whilst government was spending and we were getting the praise that Ghana is handling the management of the pandemic well, we should have had at the back of our mind that in one way or the other, we'll have to look for the resources to pay for it. And therefore, I believe in the wisdom of policymakers, the levying of those 1% here and some levies on the petroleum products is an avenue to help us plug some of the fiscal deficits that, as a country, we've recorded as a result of the pandemic.
Yes, I mean, that point that you make, that, as a country, while we were enjoying, we should have known that we're going to pay for this. But, John, I mean, we were there when government said, I'm making these provisions for you and I'm cushioning you in these areas. It's not as if we had complained or asked for any of these. And so why do we bear the brunt?
I mean, one thing about economic policy is if you want to listen to everybody before you come out with the policy, you will not implement anything, or in fact, you'll be inundated. So decision makers have decisions to make. And in their honest assessment at the time, we all know that during crisis or in the heat of pandemics, the vulnerable people in society become even more vulnerable. So as a government, if you were sitting on that seat, I'm sure you would also critically look at which areas can we provide some support in one way or the other to ensure that the vulnerabilities in the system is managed in a way that our brothers and sisters who, for one reason or the other, are already finding it difficult to find their food, do not unduly suffer because of something they did not cause.
The challenge, however, is that while you're seeking to cushion the vulnerable, research indicates that more than 70% of those who were expected to benefit from, for instance, free water did not benefit. What that could mean is that those who supplied these persons the water charged them because they were asked by government to actually bring the bills to government. They could go to government, say, we supply this amount, this quantity of water, get the money, and in the end, the very person who's expected to be the beneficiary and thus have some income to spend, does not benefit.
Yeah, you asked me one question, and I think this issue is another one. As for the policy intention, it was well grounded. Implementation is another one. Execution is different from the policy itself. And what you are talking about now is how the program was executed. I'm not an expert in these kind of social intervention programs, execution of social intervention programs. So as an association of bankers, when we had to go through a similar process where we had to feed people on the street during the lockdown, when we had to provide deprived and vulnerable households with food baskets, we knew we did not have the database and we did not have the expertise. So what did we do? We went to the institutions that had that database, that had the resources and the infrastructure to be able to do that. So we used the religious and faith-based organizations in undertaking our social intervention programs. So we used the Ahmadiyya Muslim Mission, the Red Cross, the Catholic, we used the Presbyterian Church, and all the religious bodies were involved in our relief programs. And I believe lessons learned from this is when government is going through similar programs in the future, we need to look at identifiable groupings whose business it is already, whether there has been a pandemic or not, in the provision of these kind of relief assistance, and then give these kind of relief responsibilities to them to execute on behalf of government. That way, you take away the politics that always find its way into our national discourse, even when lives are at stake. And in my view, that is how it should have been handled. But I'm not an expert in this area. But all I can say is I think the policy intention or objective was well grounded.
Let's get into an area where you have expertise, and that area is the imposition of a 5% tax on your profits before tax. What is the problem with that? There's
a lot of problems with that. First and foremost, banks are already paying a special levy. There is something we have in our tax build-up called the National Stabilization Levy. It is a levy that was introduced as a National Reconstruction Levy in the year 2000, or I believe 2001, and it was supposed to be in place for a period of 3 years. And we are in 2021, that levy is still with us. We pay 5% of our profit before tax already as banks as special levy towards national reconstruction and national stabilization. So this proposed levy is an additional on top of what we are already paying. And what we are saying is that additional tax burden will push the effective tax rate on banks to in excess of 35%, and makes us very uncompetitive to the investor world. And when we say we are uncompetitive, we are all looking for the same private capital to be able to do the financial intermediation that we do. So,
hello, John?
What this seeks to do is to limit our ability to attract private capital, and if unable, then it limits our capacity to do more. And during this economic recovery process, one thing from the banks, the anchor of economic recovery, it is not to limit their capacity rate. Their capacity is to be able to even do more and deliver towards the national agenda. And that is why we see it as a bit misplaced and potentially counterproductive.
Help us understand why you think it is potentially counterproductive. Because you have also said that, look, some of these taxes are what has to be done in order to get the economy on track. Government says it spent 21 billion Ghana cedis in cleaning the financial sector, which experts have said was necessary. So if it was necessary to do so, why is it not necessary to pay for it?
We are not against closing the fiscal gap, not at all. We are bankers and we are liquidity managers. So we understand the situation that the finance minister has put before the country, that there is a gap and that gap must be plugged in one way or the other. What we are against is the mode or the manner in which that gap is being plugged. And in this case, leaving one industry to shoulder a burden for the entire country. Why do I say this? You can put a call through to the Commissioner General of Ghana Revenue Authority, and he will tell you, he will confirm. And I'm saying this on authority because he said it in several meetings that we've had with him, that banking institutions in the country, in Ghana or our industry, is about the most compliant tax compliant industry in the country. We are not called to come and pay taxes. We go and pay before due date. And therefore, it's not like we are running away from payment of taxes. What we are saying is it makes us uncompetitive, and we are in an environment where we're going into AFTA, that is Africa Continental Free Trade arena. And what you need is banks, strong banks, resilient banks that can help business, corporate Ghana to take advantage of AFTA. Because corporate Ghana is no longer competing from the business in cantonments. North Kaneshi is not competing with the one on the Spintex Road. The one on the Spintex Road is competing with somebody in Kaduna, in Mombasa, or in Kampala. So the situation in Kampala, Kaduna, or Mombasa must be of interest of these corporate taxes and levies. That is where our concern is situated. So we are never against it.
Okay.
If we were consulted, we would have come to the table with other alternative or other mechanisms of perhaps getting more by not unduly leaving one industry. And also one thing we are not comfortable with is the justification or the rationale for the imposition of the tax, that to clean up the banking sector. It connotes that the remaining banks played a certain role in the collapse of the banks that went down for one reason or the other, alleged one reason or the other. And I do not think that is a tag that the remaining banks want to carry, that we have stood strong. The remaining banks are resilient, properly governed. They are stronger banks, good liquidity. They are helping with the national machinery. And all of a sudden, for doing the good thing, you are being penalized because A, B, and C happened in another bank. We do not think that characterization is good for the industry. If a third party is looking at this from an external country, talking about the rationale for the imposition of this tax, what comes to mind is perhaps there is a report that implicates the remaining banks as having caused the downfall of the banks that went down. But that is not the case, and that is why we do not think the imposition is in the right direction, and also the justification is well grounded.
I will get back to this particular point, but first let's get to the point you make that it makes you uncompetitive. How does this make you non-competitive? Help us understand.
Okay, so now banks in Ghana, if this one goes through, banks in Ghana effectively, our effective tax rate will be 35%. If you go to Nigeria, it's 30%. If you go to Cote d'Ivoire, it's 25%. If you go to Burkina, it's somewhere around 27 or that. So if you were a private investor and you were looking for a bank in the West African region to invest in, to take advantage of, say, AFCFTA, where will you go? Will you go to Cote d'Ivoire where the tax burden is lower, or you come to Ghana where our effective tax rate is taking us to like 35%? That is why we are not competing with ourselves. We are competing with the global economy. And it is in the interest of all of us that the cost of doing business in Ghana is not unduly heightened by one action or the other, and that we work together to bring cost of lending and cost of doing business down generally. And that is why we are not really comfortable with this proposal. And we believe that the policy makers are listening and they will do something about this, because it is currently a proposal and going through consideration, and something can still be done about it.
Great. Now you make a point that, based on how this is done, Mr. John Ewa, it's looking as if you created the problem when the surviving banks did not create a problem. So where were you expecting government to go for the money?
Okay, so let's see it from this angle. When the banking sector cleanup happened, where did the benefit lie? Did it lie in the economy of Ghana, or it only lied in the banking sector?
You want to answer that?
Yes.
Tell me.
It was a national agenda, a plan to help sanitize the banking system. And the banking system is not made of only the banks. The banking system comprises banks, customers, market participants, investors, and everybody else. So if there is an activity within the system that needs sanitizing, then whoever participates in that infrastructure must also pay the price. It should not be those who are at the service point delivering it and bearing the brunt of everything, but that as a community of market participants, we all have a duty and we all benefited from the cleanup. Confidence went down, but with the cleanup, trust and confidence in the financial system has come up. So you, Winston, as you are sitting there now, if you have money in a bank, you are comfortable because you know you are dealing with stronger, resilient, and well-governed banks. So we do not think that by targeting one industry, we did the right thing, because the problem was caused in that industry. We do not think that was that is the best way to go about it.
When you say whoever participated, because it benefited the economy, let me get it clearly. Are you suggesting that all of us bear the cost? And so just like we're doing in the payment of other taxes, all of us should pay for it without it necessarily being the burden of the banks?
What I'm saying is there are various sectors of the economy. I'm not by saying participants should pay for it, connoting that maybe we should tax individuals who have bank accounts to be paying for the tax. No, far from it. What I'm saying is, instead of maybe levying 5% on banks, what about the telecommunication industry? They also benefited because they are participants in the banking system. What about the mining industry? They are also participants. There are pockets and pockets of industries that have also benefited from the cleanup of the financial system. Why not say 2%, 1%, 1%, 1% here, and you get 8 instead of 5? You understand? So there are other creative ways that this could have been looked at without placing the tax burden and tax incidence on one sector of the economy.
But let's look at it this way also. And you talk about the banks and how those of you who have done well are struggling for it. But maybe you can also remember that technically speaking, some of these banks whose licenses were revoked, 5 of them became, in fact more than 5, became the Consolidated Bank of Ghana. UT Bank Capital Bank are part of GCB Bank. So, doesn't that tell you that these banks whose licenses were revoked just did not go, but for some reasons they were consolidated to continue functioning, and thus if there's a need to fund that bailout, the banks should play the major role?
No, I think the reverse is rather true, because there were stronger banks that were able to receive or accommodate those banks, and therefore they became one. So must you punish Consolidated Bank because Consolidated Bank was able to organize and get 5 banks together to function as an institution? No. You understand? I think on the reverse, Consolidated Bank rather must be commended, must be given all the ammunition to be able to employ more people, to be able to help more businesses. It's not to say that because you, when we banks went down, you were the institution that absorbed them. For that reason, we are penalizing. I don't think that was the rationale or the reasoning behind the imposition of this tax. I do not think. I don't want to even go into that discussion, because I don't think that was the reasoning. Because if that was the reason, then the reverse is rather the truth.
You've talked about, I've read in the graphic that this is likely to cost banks some 300 million Ghana cedis. Now, that 300 million Ghana cedi that is going to cost you, you've talked about it making you uncompetitive. Now, how would that affect, one, those who work in the banks, and two, those of us who transact businesses with the banks?
Okay, so let me tell you. During the initial stages of the pandemic, and just to get the economy going, the banking regulator came out with some regulatory measures. And through those regulatory measures, banks were properly clothed to be able to do some further financial intermediation. So when the cash reserve requirement was reduced from 10% to 8%, banks immediately, we had a meeting and said we have to also respond quickly and fast. And immediately, lending rate of banks came down from between 1.5 to 3.5%, depending on the banks and where the bank's lending rate was before the regulatory measure. So we saved borrowers up to 350 basis points of interest rate because of the regulatory measure that was put in place. That alone, when you say 3.5%, you may think it's very small. That alone translates roughly on average to about 194 million Ghana cedis in interest income that should have gone to the banks. That bank said, borrowing customers, we are all going through challenges. Use this to also take care of other ancillary bills that may come your way because of the pandemic. Again, as a result of the reduction in the capital conservation buffer, banks were capacitized to be able to give a lot more loans. During the pandemic, in excess of 14 billion new loans were granted. And put this in perspective, when there is uncertainty, when the climate is not, the coast is not that clear, banks rather coil into their shells and watch. But what did they do? We did not sit and did nothing. We said we had to contribute towards the recovery, make sure the health situation does not result in economic collapse. And therefore, 14 billion new loans was granted. Again, we knew of sectors that had been badly hit. The education sector, the leisure industry, religious sector. These were sectors that were almost, the cash flows disappeared overnight. So banks sat with the businesses in these sectors, and in excess of 4 billion loans were restructured. And I can tell you with facts right on my desk here that there are companies that were given up to 1 year repayment holiday, not to pay anything for 1 year. So banks did a lot. So when people are talking about, during the crisis, the economy was still functioning and things were going well, what people don't know was behind that was the banks. Behind that economy working well was the fact that banks did not leave their customers to hang. banks stayed very true to their commitment to their customers and provided liquidity to ensure that the wheels of the country did not grind to a halt. As I speak, we still have in excess of 5 billion in approved loans that is currently going through the process for customers to just meet conditions and draw down. That is what, I believe that is the kind of discussion we should all be interested in, the kind of discussion we want banks to be having. Actually, at this stage, we actually do not want to be engaging in discussions that limit our ability to do more, but discussions that says, what else can we do for you so that we can do more?
Now, talking about what else you can do so that we can do more, how is the imposition of this tax going to affect that what else you can do so that we can do more?
Roughly on average, that is 300 million in taxes translate to about 3 billion in loans that you cannot give. I mean, this is off the cuff. You understand? Because capital adequacy, the limit is 10%. If I say that the 300 million was going directly into capital accumulation, it is going to add to our capital base, then it's about 3 billion in loans that you cannot give. So do we want to be discussing how much loans we cannot give, or we want to be discussing how much more loans we can give? And that is where we get a bit worried and a bit concerned that this situation is what it is. And we still have the confidence that there are opportunities for all of us to sit around the table and see, perhaps, if we are a little bit more creative, we can get more by not levying one industry, but cutting it across so that, per head becomes less burdensome to carry.
So you're suggesting to us that if this continues and if it's approved by Parliament, banks are going to reduce the loans that they give to the general public and businesses?
I wouldn't say I'm going to reduce per se, but what I'm saying is it limits our capacity to
but
do more.
If it limits your capacity to
already,
do loans.
And truth be told, banks do not convert 100% of their profit into capital. A certain percentage will go into reserves, a certain percentage will go into dividend. So I just said off the cuff, if you wanted a ballpark number. But what I'm saying is it limits us. Anything that you take, which could have gone to help accumulate capital, if you take away from the banks, what you're doing is limiting the bank in one way or the other, indirectly, from being able to do more.
Exactly. And if you limit the banks directly from being able to do more, and you've given the explanation, that could result, and most likely result, in a reduction in the loans that you give. You've talked about having some 5 billion Ghana cedis currently pending to be approved and all of that. That may lead to a reduction in that going forward. That could also affect that. You're not denying that, are you?
No, so what I'm saying is it may not necessarily reduce lending, but growth may not be at the level that you would have preferred. If there was going to be a 10% growth in loan book from year zero to last year to now, to 2020 over 2021, perhaps instead of 10%, we may be doing 8 or 7%.
You've talked about consultations and the fact that if you were consulted, things you may have suggested other things. You've talked about spreading it. So in effect, you were not consulted on this. Has this always been the situation? Has the banks and your association always been involved in some of these, policy decisions that concern
you? As far as I know, this is about the first time that we have not had any idea that this was coming. In my previous life as an MD of a bank, I know that the finance minister himself was in the offices of GAB to take MDs through the tax provisions or recommendations that they had received and the initiatives that were coming that they wanted to roll out, and wanted feedback from the banks on what we thought about it. And even through the pandemic last year, there was significant amount of engagement between ourselves, the finance ministry, and our regulator. We had very constant, a stream of discussions. I was a member of a few committees, a meeting with actors at the finance ministry on a few issues. But unfortunately, in this levy, discussion of this levy or introduction of the levy, as an association, we were not consulted and we did not know about it.
And ever since the budget was read last Friday, have you spoken to your regulator? What has been the push-string of your regulator? What's been the push-string of your association? What's been the conversation with the individual banks?
We are making the right calls and engaging. We have a wider stakeholder grouping. So amongst the MDs, we've had our discussions and we know exactly the buttons that we have to press. We are doing everything in our power to see what can be done. Unfortunately, the decision does not lie with us. All we can do is to put the story out there so that decision makers will be clothed with the right information and the facts, and to be able to consider, if they have to reconsider, to be able to do the reconsideration.
I want to get something clear. So you've talked about spreading this 5%. Is that an indication that you are not against paying more taxes, but you think that this is just too much?
Yes, banks have never been against paying taxes. And as I said, if you go to GRA right now, they will say the banking industry is about the most compliant tax compliant industry you have in the country. We pay our taxes without any problems, and we do not have any issues with GRA as far as tax payment is concerned. Yes, we are worried that it puts us on a certain league of almost the most taxed banking industry in West Africa. And we do not think it's a tag we want to have for Ghana. And as a country, I don't think it's something that we need. At a time when people are looking for opportunities on the continent where our competitors are global, we need to be on the table that puts us in good light, not on a table that potentially can hurt the banks in the country.
Great. So let's look at that potential. And you've talked about the fact that you are willing to pay tax. But I also heard you say, in putting you in good light, in making you competitive, you think that this should be spread maybe 1%, 1%, 1%. So 1% for the banking sector, or 2%, 1% for the telcos, and 1% for the mining sector, right?
Yes, we believe that the incidence of tax is better spread when you have a lot more people paying, a lot more industries or sectors shouldering it. So to the extent that it's spread properly, we are okay. We are okay with it. And I also think it should be characterized properly. Where the levy is sitting and the characterization of it connotes a certain kind of sin that has been committed by the remaining banks. And we do not think that we merit that characterization.
Let's deal a bit with the characterization and why you think you do not merit it. So you see this more as what? A punishment because you make reference to the sins of the remaining banks. Is that how you see it?
I did not. I'm not the one who called it that. So
no, I'm asking you whether you see it like
actually my attention was actually drawn to this by somebody else. I got a call from somebody outside of the country who had read and I think has seen a few articles on our feedback on the proposal and said that, John, even the angle you are pursuing this is not the angle we are looking at it. The angle we are assessing is it sends a signal that you guys have done something wrong and we don't know about it.
Okay, but you believe in that argument, don't you? You say it's more like you're paying for.
It's a third party telling me. The thing is, if you are the one charting the path, sometimes you don't know that the line is crooked until somebody tells you, look back and see what you've done.
And in looking back, you see it as more of paying for the sins of another person which you have not committed. Is that how you?
Of course. The remaining banks were the strong banks, resilient banks. I'm not sure the remaining banks are the banks that did anything wrong. Yeah.
Great. So my guest this evening is John Ewuah. He is the CEO of the Ghana Association of Bankers, and we're having a conversation about the taxes that have been imposed, particularly on banks, during the presentation of the 2021 budget statement by Majority Leader Minister in charge of Parliamentary Affairs, also the caretaker minister at the Ministry of Finance, Osechi Mensah-Bonsu. We'll continue with the conversation itself. We'll continue with the conversation after these few messages here on Upfront on the JoyNews channel. I'm Winston Amon. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, so welcome back from that short break. And thank you very much for staying with us here on Upfront on the JoyNews channel. This evening, we're speaking to John Ewa, who's CEO of the Ghana Association of Bankers. And this evening, we're having a conversation about the 2021 budget, particularly the imposition of taxes on the bank's 5% profit before tax. And he says this would affect them and this will make them uncompetitive when it comes to the global market, because they're not just dealing with, Ghanaian investors, they're dealing with investors from all over the African continent and the globe. And if you have Ivory Coast, paying less in taxes when it comes to banks, they would go to them. So you've talked about how you are in talks with your regulator and you're trying to press a few buttons. So far, the conversation that you've had, does it look like you are becoming successful in having this tax relooked at?
No, I don't think that is a discussion I want to have on a platform like this for now. If you are advocating for something on behind the scenes and making calls, I do not think that the right way to handle it is to come in public when you are still in the middle of it. I'm sure at the end of the day, the public will be the best judges for themselves if we are successful, and if you are not, you also know about it. Great.
So we certainly will be waiting to find out how that goes. But let's look at your sector broadly also. You've talked about how you were able to help during the COVID-19 situation. But during COVID-19 itself, we're still in COVID-19, but during the last year when the COVID hit the country and hit our economy so hard, how did that impact you?
It did. Banks are just like other businesses in the country, and by nature of our operations, we face new people every day. If you go to the banking hall, people you see today are completely different from those who will come tomorrow. Even from hour to hour, you are meeting new people. So we are very much at the forefront, and therefore the infection that we had in the country, and banks were also in one way or the other impacted. But what we did was to, aside the guidelines that were issued by the Health Service, Ghana Health Service, and the Ghana Medical Association, we picked it up and set up a stricter guideline for the banking industry, which we sent to our members, and those were implemented. So we were successful at minimizing the impact, the direct impact on us. But to the extent that we were, of course, the virus is here with us, and we are Ghanaians, and we come to our banking halls, and we go back home. We are meeting new people. People are coming to us. We were also significantly impacted. Again, aside the direct impact that banks faced, when you talk about a hotel shutting down, or the aviation industry going completely shut down, or the transport industry, education, private schools completely off, the religious bodies and the rest completely off at some point, what you forget is all these organizations have banks. Mm-hmm. And if they are struggling, then it means they are struggling in meeting their obligations on facilities they may have taken from banks. So we are not only suffering from the COVID directly from our own activities, we are also we are having a residual impact from the suffering of other sectors that have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. So the banking industry, actually, we have not, COVID can end today, but we will live with it for a while, because the transmission from being a not so good asset to being a bad loan can take a while. And that is what our fears are. And we are just hoping that it doesn't get to levels that becomes systemically problematic for the industry.
I feel that, while you're going through all these also, it gave you the opportunity to increase your assets because people then needed assistance and the banks had to come to their aid.
Yes, yes, and that is why, in my view, I really commend the banks for the work that they did during the pandemic. And in the boardrooms, I could only picture the kind of discussions that would have gone in the boardrooms when we took the decision that, you know what, though there is a pandemic facing us, we need to step up and make sure the economy doesn't collapse. And therefore, we respond adequately to the policies from the government, responded adequately to the regulatory measures introduced by our industry regulator, and all the other, and now on our own, also created avenues to limit the impact of the virus on our people by making our alternate channels available to our customers, so that instead of going to the banking hall for everything, most of the things we made sure customers were able to do from their homes and from on their devices. So to that extent, I would say that we did everything we could during the heat of the pandemic to weather the storm. But banks, the way our earning structure is, it is not like you're going to buy a call card and once you use it, it's gone and revenue is earned. When we earn the revenue, we are still watching whether it's coming back to hurt us because the loan is still on our books. And when you lose one loan, you don't just lose the interest income that you would have earned, you lose the capital that you also gave out. And that is why we as bankers are very careful in certain environments or environments that you are not able to plan properly because of the uncertainties around. But there was also a national cost to ensure that the wheels of the country kept running.
Do you still feel that uncertainty around?
I think as a country, we've done pretty well. If I read research papers from other parts of the world, even from the developed world to even other parts of Africa, you can see clearly that Ghana really responded adequately and were up to the task in fighting the pandemic and its effects. So to that extent, in my view, personal view though, I think as a country, we can pat ourselves on the back.
So you talked about, the fact that you had to reduce, lending rates. Yes, that we saw between 1.5 to 3.5 to cushion lots of Ghanaians. There was also negotiations, particularly when it comes to the payment of principals. Now, there are some who are beginning to ask these questions. I see a lot of people asking me the question. So these lending rates that have been reduced, would they continue like that? Or when it looks like we're getting out of COVID, you may bring it back to the previous levels?
Yeah, as I said, a portion of the reduction in lending rates was a direct response to the regulatory interventions from the central bank. When the cash reserve ratio was reduced from 10% to 8%, it gave banks some liquidity, additional liquidity, to be able to do a lot more financial intermediation at a lesser cost. So to the extent that the regulatory measures are kept in place during this period and perhaps beyond, we are happy to say that the rates will be at the levels or even better depending on the other variables. Interest rate is a derivative from other variables, from your 91-day benchmark to the interbank lending rate to your policy rate and to all the other market inflation and all the others. So to the extent that other macro indicators are looking in the right direction, interest rates will continue to move in tandem. As market rates come down, interest rate lending rates definitely will respond accordingly. And that includes responding from even the reduction that we have already recorded.
Great. Our time is almost up and we need to be wrapping up. And so finally, for you as, Ghana Association of Bankers, for those of you within the banking sector, you say these taxes should be spread, even though you think that it's important for us to, raise funds because we cannot continuously borrow our way out of COVID-19. You think that this burden on just the banks will be too much. What will be your final comments?
Thank you very much. My final comments are that we are very much in support of the national agenda to fast track the pace of the economic recovery post-COVID. And we need all hands on deck. Every sector must come to the show to demonstrate support to the economy. As banks, we have taken the decision to help with the economic recovery process by lending to productive sectors. So we are talking here to policymakers that we need help to be able to do more. And if that means taking a second look at this levy that potentially can make us uncompetitive in attracting private capital and also potentially can increase the cost of lending or cost of doing business, should be taking a second look. At the end of the day, we are also interested in nation building so that the country can fast track our way out of COVID and economically also progress positively.
John Ewa, thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. We're very grateful. Right, so that's John Ewa, who is CEO of the Ghana Association of Bankers, joining us this evening on UPfront on the JoyNews channel. On behalf of the team, thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Winston Amma. Coming up next is the JoyNews Prime. Catch you tomorrow on the Super Morning Show on Joy 99.7 FM, right from 5:50 a.m. to 10 a.m. Have a lovely evening.